First of all, hello everyone. It's great to be here in Doha, and has been a very productive few hours here in Qatar. And I've very much enjoyed the panels that I was able to listen to prior. But to Morgan's point, WGDP was an all-of-government effort to coordinate the activities of the U.S. government as it pertains to women's economic empowerment in the developing world. So we have numerous well-intended and oftentimes well-executed programs across the globe, but there needed to be a coordinating function that would create cohesion and create a central mission. And obviously, development assistance, the goal of it is for it to no longer be necessary and for it to cease to exist. But all too often, development assistance becomes more of an entitlement, and recipient countries don't transition to self-reliance and ultimately to trading partners, which is the primary intention. And we believe that one of the core reasons why that transition doesn't happen is because women are oftentimes grossly underutilized in these societies. And women are oftentimes, as part of development assistance plans, really a footnote or an asterisk in the thought process on how to fully develop an economy. So WGDP sought to empower 50 million women by 2025 through 3 pillars. The first is vocational training and education. And this is specific to women acquiring the skills to be able to secure a job in their local economies, or taking the existing skills they have and fueling productivity through technology. And I've seen countless examples of where USAID or Peace Corps comes into a community and increases the productivity and therefore creates tremendous opportunity for families within that community. The second is increasing access to capital, mentorship, and networks for women entrepreneurs. Here in Qatar, we see a great example of entrepreneurship thriving and women within that entrepreneurial ecosystem thriving as well. So this is incredibly important, both at home and around the world, particularly access to credit. And there's all sorts of reasons why women in countries across the globe have inadequate access to the capital they need to start and grow a business. So you have to take a local approach, but it's something we're very committed to tackling, and we've launched several initiatives with that goal. And then the third, and I think this is probably the most important pillar of the initiative, is changing the laws and regulations that prohibit women from fully and freely participating in their local economies. So just to give you an example, in 104 countries around the world, 2.7 billion women are not able to work in the same industries as men, oftentimes the predominant industries in those countries. In 75 countries in the world, women are not allowed to own, manage, or inherit property. So there are countless obstacles that are in the path of women being able to realize their full potential and therefore help a society develop and flourish. One last thing, just going back to the initial question, obviously a society can't succeed if 50% of its population goes or under-tapped. But there's also a critical security element. So you had mentioned that we had launched the initiative at the Munich Security Conference, and this is not a subject that most of the people there were used to seeing taken center stage. But it is important to bring that into the discussion because there is an incredibly high correlation between political instability and discrimination against women. And we see it time and time again, actually, in the countries that rank lowest on the Index for Gender Discrimination. Over the last 2 decades, 17 of 20 of them have been involved in armed conflict, either interstate or intrastate. So making sure that people realize the security implications of women's empowerment globally.
Well, and to that end, most people may not even realize that you did something significant that no one has ever done before with the president. You were able to put women's economic prosperity into the national security strategy. That was so important to me that you did that, and I'd love for you to explain that.
We have opportunities such as this to coalesce around some central ideas. And people obviously talk a lot about women's economic empowerment. There are a lot of tremendous initiatives, many of which the US government was a partner in launching. We launched the WeFi initiative to help small and medium-sized businesses in the developing world gain access to capital at the G20 in Hamburg. We launched the 2X initiative also with a goal of helping women entrepreneurs grow and flourish through access to capital, and challenged the other development finance institutions at the G7 in Canada to think about their investing through a gender lens. And they took that 2X challenge. So convenings are an incredible opportunity for us to focus our work and align our efforts. And the United States, under President Trump, feels that we have a tremendous opportunity to further this work through the G7, which we will be hosting this year in the United States, and to bring not only the other G7 countries, but also develop out a broader dialogue around some of the legal and cultural barriers. So the 5 that WGDP specifically tackles, and you and I have talked about this often, and with initiatives like this, you can go a mile wide and an inch deep, or you can go quite deep and actually try to get things done. So the 5 laws that we are working through, either technical assistance of the United States government, legal assistance, funding NGOs that are on the ground in those countries, and legal advocates, are the ability to work in the same industries as men, the ability of women to access credit and be able to be banked, the ability of women to access institution, courts of law, for example, being able to start and open a business without the consent of a male relative, the ability of women to own, inherit, and manage property, and the ability of women to travel freely. All 5, we think, are foundational to women being able to have their full potential unleashed. Certainly, this list isn't exhaustive, but given the number of legal barriers that exist around the globe to these 5 laws, we think it's a very important foundational place to start.
And so that's under Pillar 3, right? And we have so many countries here represented, and you've said that Pillar 3 is really the foundational part of WGDP. What can the countries represented here do to support you on Pillar 3?
Well, it's us supporting each other. So in some cases, countries are incredibly excited, but they need technical assistance. They want technical assistance so that they can have clean property title. So titling is often a challenge in our hemisphere as well. I was recently in Colombia, and we're funding efforts to help men and women secure clean title to their land, and therefore enable them to accumulate wealth by being able to invest in their land's productivity and ensure that they have that as an asset they can continue to grow. In other cases, it should be a substantive part of our diplomatic conversations. Development assistance is different from foreign aid, and it should be treated differently. So if a country that we continue to provide development assistance to has these laws in place that prohibit women from fully contributing, that's a conversation we should be having as a collective to try and understand why, and to have a real discussion about the limitation that places on the country.
So speaking of travels, you've been in Morocco recently, and I believe that they made progress on land rights for women of their country. Can you tell us more about the trip and the highlights?
And the Morocco trip was phenomenal, and it MCC has been on the ground there for several years now and has been so helpful in driving the ball on this initiative. And this is why it's important to have this all-of-government approach, because in some areas, Peace Corps has been in there for decades. In other areas, MCC is working on unlocking a compact and very integrated with the local governments in these regions. In my conversations with the King of Morocco and government leadership there, we had talked about the collective lands and the ambiguous ability of women to participate in the proceeds of those lands. So one of the things that we were incredibly excited about and now is being fully implemented is the clarification legally that women could benefit from the proceeds of that land, which is incredibly important to women in Morocco. It's very agricultural society, and the ability to own one's land and be able to leverage that land to accumulate capital is very important. So it was a great success, and it was the result of many months and years of working together and collaborating.
So you just mentioned Colombia, and you also returned on a swing through Latin America with our Deputy Secretary of State, John Sullivan. Can you tell us about some of your impressions? And I think it'd be interesting to compare and contrast that swing versus your recent Morocco trip as well.
The swing through Latin America was incredibly interesting. We were in Paraguay, in Argentina, and in Colombia, and we had a different deliverable and a different focal point of each visit. In Paraguay, we focused on vocational education and job training, really that technical assistance. It's the country that the Peace Corps has been in longer than any country in the world. So they have a real strong grassroots connection to Paraguay, which allowed us to hear from women deep in the rural communities about the unique challenges they had. And fund programs to assist them. In Argentina, we went to the north of Argentina and visited with some incredible women entrepreneurs that through our Pro Mejor program, we are helping fund. And they formed something similar to what I had seen in rural Cote d'Ivoire, which was collectives, where the women in communities would come together. They would pool their resources, and because of those pooled resources, they were able to secure a loan, and then they would each vouch for one another. So monthly or quarterly, they would go and they would make their payments, and if any one of them was short, somebody else would step in and backfill that loan, and it was an incredible thing to see the tightness of the community that existed and the scale to which that program had grown throughout the rural areas of Argentina. So there's a lot of promise in that on a more micro sense. In Colombia, we worked on two major initiatives. The first is the United States government was the first country in the world to sign into law under President Trump a formal women, peace, and security piece of legislation to mandate that women are at the table in conflict negotiation and mediation. We know empirically that when women are involved in negotiations, the likelihood that peace sustains itself for longer than 15 years increases by 35%. So there's countless amounts of data and research that show that women should be represented in conflict resolution and negotiation, and the United States followed the UN through their resolution that's was put into place on women, peace, and security 25 years ago to pass a law to that effect. So we created a partnership with Colombia. We have a deep relationship from a security standpoint and from a defense standpoint and cooperation standpoint. So we created a women, peace, and security strategy with Colombia. We also launched OPEC 2X for Latin America, which doubled what we had launched at some of the Americas in Peru. So $1 billion in our hemisphere committed to female entrepreneurs. So Each country brings unique opportunities and unique challenges. In Colombia, for example, while I was there, the president signed the equivalent of an executive order requiring that women cannot be discriminated against when securing credit. So that was new, but for the most part in Colombia, their laws are quite strong. The challenge is implementation of those laws when you get out of the cities and into the more rural communities. And we see that across the globe, that even when the laws are in place, the implementation of those laws and the knowledge of one's rights, when you get into communities that are further and further removed from the city center, that awareness really diminishes. So a lot of the work we're doing is to help on the implementation of existing laws as well.
So speaking of entrepreneurs, you're doing so much work with so many governments around the world, but I know the private sector also plays a key role in WGDP. What can everyone here that's representing the private sector do?
Well, I think first and foremost, align around the central mission and the goal of what we're trying to accomplish. And every initiative that I've worked on in this administration, probably colored by the fact that I came from this private sector, and I'm a true believer that that's where innovation happens. Government can scale best practices and can help expand upon them, but innovation happens at a local level and is driven by the private sector. So it's incredibly important to have private sector partners along each of these three pillars. In the 2X example in our Western Hemisphere, it was Citibank who put up $500 million to match OPIC's $500 million to enable women entrepreneurs to secure credit. We've partnered with companies ranging from Walmart to MasterCard and beyond on Pillar 1 and Pillar 3. I think one of the challenges with a lot of the programs, especially around vocational education, which every country is focused on, but in America, we're very focused on job training and vocational education across the board to help people just starting out in their career and mid to late career workers realize their full potential. But if you don't have a private sector partner to help implement those programs, they seldom work. So we see in our own government that the government-led job training programs are oftentimes failure. It's when you have the government, particularly state and local, teamed with an academic institution and an employer, that you start to see a cycle that works and you start to see real results, because ultimately the training is driven by the demand. So a lot of the countries that we're entering, we're not standing up vocational or training programs unless we have a private sector partner who wants to employ the people we're training in that market. So it's absolutely critical to the success of all of these programs.
Well, it is sadly time for my last question already. And I know I embarrass Ivanka when I do this, but I always brag on her wherever we go around the world to do this, because she spends so much of her time and her effort and her agency. She could be doing anything. And what she is doing to empower women around the world is one of the most inspiring things that I have ever seen up close. And I am so thrilled to be, I'm very minor role in helping you with it. But on that note, because you are spending so much of your time doing this, you want to have long-lasting impact. We see government initiatives that sort of fail or that don't continue to have a life. So with all of this successes of the initial launch, what are you doing to make sure that this lasts much beyond your time in the White House?
Well, it's a very good point. Oftentimes, well-designed programs collapse onto themselves or are redundant of existing ones. We spent roughly 2 years engaged with over 200 stakeholders from the NGO community, bipartisan lawmakers, developing something that was unique, that would resonate, and that had tremendous buy-in prior to launch. So that's why we waited until last year to launch the initiative. We also ensured through the president establishing WGDP through a national security presidential memorandum that 14 different federal agencies were at the table and aligned with us in our efforts across these three pillars to drive outcome, measurable outcome and ultimately success. But the way I think about it is a program or initiative should not last unless it's so good that people don't want to see it go away. And our hope with this is because of the rigorous metrics we're attaching to success, because of the focus that we've put into crafting each of the initiatives under each of the different pillars, that it will be a great example of development assistance done right.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Morgan.